Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. You're here for episode number 8, in which we will be looking at the replacement child syndrome. And I think that this can be something really important for us today. What does it say about us as people developing in our world when we carry with us something that doesn't really belong to us? We're going to be unpacking this as we go on today. And I guess where I want to start is just by connecting us with what we spoke about last week. You'll remember we were talking about the Ancestor Syndrome, in which really a child or a young person is taking on something that doesn't belong to them. It's as though they are transmitting a trauma or an issue that belongs to somebody in their family. Hello, A. It's very good to see you. Thank you for coming today. It's as though they carry something that has been put into their lives. It's like it's been deposited into them from their parents or from a near relative. And as the child begins to form an identity, it's as though this is taken with them into their lives and into their understanding of themselves and how they function in the world today. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I think maybe what it would be really useful to do is to talk for a few minutes, just to get our bearings about the difference between a disease, a syndrome, and a disorder. So why do we refer to the replacement child concept as a syndrome when it becomes problematic in a person's life? Well, just have a look at this simple definition. A syndrome is a group of symptoms which consistently occur together, or is a condition characterized by a set of associated symptoms. We distinguish it from disease in this way. A disease is a pathological response to internal or external factors, and a disorder is a disruption to regular bodily structure and function. So a syndrome is like a collection of ideas and things working together that disrupts a person's life, or is working in a way that it identifies as something that they need to be dealing with. So let's go a little bit further in this. I have been doing some very basic research into this. I'm going to be sharing part of my own story a little bit later on in relation to this idea. But then I also thought that it would be important to point to some other stories just so that we can cross-reference what we're talking about. So let's just take a look for a few minutes about what we're talking about when it comes to a replacement child. What exactly is it that we mean? So replacement child is defined as one who is born to take the place of a deceased child. That's basically how it was classically conceived of initially. But it's been broadened, I guess, by researchers and by practitioners who have found that it's more than this. And I'm quoting from Abigail Brenner, who is a psychiatrist who publishes a lot in Psychology Today. You should just Google the title, "Are You a Replacement Child?" In your browser and her name, and it'll come up with this article. And I've referred to it a fair amount in this broadcast. I think it's really clear what she's saying, and her article is very definitely worth a read. This is what she said. Over time, the definition has become expanded to include an older child whose role within the family may be shifted in order to take over for a deceased sibling because of parental pressure and or survivor guilt. So in other words, what happens is that there's a tragedy in the family. Somebody dies. There is a serious accident. There is an accident that perhaps includes fire or severe trauma, and leaves somebody in the family deeply wounded or indeed deceased. And it's as though one of the siblings of that child is subtly encouraged to respond to that, and so takes into their own identity something about the tragedy that has taken place that doesn't belong to them. And it's again this concept of a parent or a caregiver depositing something onto the person's life. Greetings to those who have come. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining in today. We really do appreciate the fact that there are those who can come and spend time on this. If you want to catch it up, of course, it's also on YouTube and on the Core Issues Trust website. And I do hope that it will be useful for you. So let's just go back to that slide. We're talking about how the definition of the classical definition of the replacement child has changed. So we've spoken about an older child, perhaps, who is basically functionally takes over for the deceased sibling in some way. But it also can be a child who is made to feel responsible for a sibling who is handicapped or challenged or incapacitated from birth, or becomes so during the course of their life. And finally, a child who is adopted to take the place of a biological child that the parents were unable to have. So that's another concept. So the adoptee feels, well, I'm the second choice. The first choice would be, hello, Minyu, very good to see you. Thank you for coming. The first choice, the parents didn't get. They tried to have their own child, and it didn't work out for them. Perhaps there was a problem with one or other of them, a physiological problem, which meant that they couldn't have children. So they chose to adopt, a great thing to do. And but the issue is, if the parents treat that as, second best, or communicates that fact to the adoptee, to the child who's coming into the family, that child can imbibe in their own identity a sense of, well, I'm second best. They missed the first opportunity to have their own biological children, but they found me and I'm the one. Do you get what I'm saying? It's a subtle thing, but children are sensitive to where they fit in the family structure. Welcome, Peter from South Africa. So good to have you. Thank you for taking the time. I really do hope it's useful to you. Love to know where Min is from. Are you in the UK? Do let me know. So the replacement child, why is this important to talk about? As I say, I'm going to be sharing more about my own story in a few minutes. But again, going back to Dr. Abigail's excellent article on Psychology Today, this is the point that essentially I'm wanting to make. Sometimes depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, perfectionism, or survivor guilt are symptoms of the replacement child syndrome, even though we may not understand the reason behind it. Now, please understand, I'm not saying that if you are a perfectionist, this is, by that fact, an indicator that you have replacement child syndrome operating in your life. Similarly, anxiety and depression and low self-esteem can have many different causes. But I'm just saying that sometimes these symptoms occur when people are struggling with replacement child syndrome. But here's the point that Dr. Abigail certainly is making. Once we become aware that the replacement child syndrome is operating, we may be able to reinterpret what they have been feeling about themselves in an entirely different way. Sorry, that wasn't very well expressed, but what we're saying is those who are helping people who appear to have replacement child syndrome operating in their life, if we can help them to understand that this is a fact and how it's developed over time, it's possible that we can help them to reinterpret their own histories and therefore to gain a sense of their own identity as opposed to what they have inherited, if you like. I think this is just a part of becoming increasingly able to, empower yourself and be your own person. And Min is from Malaysia. That's really nice. And Vanya, it's good to see you. Thank you for joining us today. I would miss you if you were not here, Vanya. I want you to know. So, and all of you, thank you so much for coming. Okay, just one more point I want to make here. Replacement children can be very resourceful and super achievers in later life because they've learned to draw inner strength from within themselves as they have asserted their own sense of identity. And I think this is a really good point that, again, Dr. Abigail Brenner is making in her article, Are You a Replacement Child? Look it up. Look at the whole context of what she's saying. That's where you will get some really good information here. And I'm just sharing a little bit of that article with you today. So high achievers, that's a program in itself. These are the people who really achieve a huge amount in their lives. Where's it coming from? What's the energy that is driving that? Very often it's about being assertive. It's being about making sure the individual, leaves a mark on the world because they want to be clear in terms of their own identity. And they have very often fought very hard to free themselves, to empower themselves, to discover who they are, where they begin and where others begin. In other words, they've established boundaries between themselves and their siblings and their parents. Very often, those are the ones who make great advances in the world. I may very well be speaking to some of them today. You know how you have pulled yourself up by the bootstraps, and this has empowered you and freed you to achieve your mission. And folks, that is why mission, I believe, is really important in life. If you have somebody who is struggling with something, with depression, with anxiety, something that can really help them is to begin to focus on what they want to achieve, what they feel they're missing, and then to break it down so that there are steps of action that they can work on, and achieve, smaller things that ultimately will relate to the great achievement in life that they really want to go ahead with. So, okay, it's going to get a bit more practical as we go on, hopefully. I wanted to just introduce to you two people who you may well have seen already on our programming in one way or another. So Denis Schick, who is the founder and leader of Help for the Families. You can look up her webpage, and I'm pretty sure if you Google her, you will find some really, wonderful stories of her journey. She grew up in a home where her father left the family home and went into transgenderism. And if I recall correctly, not all of the children knew what was happening or what the motive was behind all of this, but Denise did. And her story is very much about the impact of all of this on herself as a young woman, and how that played out in terms of how she responded to that. And eventually, when she had gone through very deep waters, and then later on comes to Christ in repentance, she begins a ministry that really is an outpouring of the grief and the shame, the pain, and then the ability to deal with this in a victorious way, so that she was, much more than a survivor. She was very much a conqueror in what she achieved, and actually what began to work through the whole family. So please do follow her story. I have put it on this slide, and hopefully when this program appears on YouTube, you can go back to it and get the link. As I say, it's available there. Help for the Families, Denise. Oh, I've spelt it wrong. Typical me. Denis Schick. I'm so sorry. There should be an E on the end there. Apologies, Denise, if you ever see this. That should not happen. But you can also find her story on the International Federation for Therapeutic and Counseling Choice website. There'll be something there about her presentation at the conference last year. But the second person that I wanted to mention is somebody who is part of our own team on Core Issues Trust, Ashley Whitehouse. She tells the story of how she grew up in a home where her father clearly was troubled by homosexual feelings, and again left the home and went into a gay lifestyle and eventually married his partner. And she too talks about the trauma, the pain, and the very significant impact that had on the family, and particularly on her older brother, who suffered greatly because of all of this and took it very much on himself. Now, these are not examples of replacement children exactly, but it is, both of them are very much about ancestor syndrome, or about this whole idea of how trauma is transmitted within a generation or across a generation. So if it's intergenerational, it means that it goes between members of a particular generation. But if it's cross-generational, it means it goes to the next set of a generation. So if I pass it on to my children, that would probably be cross-generational. Well, it is cross-generational. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how trauma is perpetuated, and why it is we have to be very careful in the way we deal with our children, our spouses, how we react to trauma in our families. I guess, years ago, medics perhaps would say to those who had suffered in this way, the best way to get over a death, the death of your child, is to go home and prepare for the birth of another child. That's how it was dealt with, if I understand correctly. So then the sufferer would not necessarily process the grief. They would not have had access to grief counseling, as is more readily available today. They would simply go home and accept what had happened to them and deal with it by having another child. I don't know if you relate to this at all, but I'm hoping you can see how this can be really, really important in terms of the experience of a young child in a family who then begins to integrate and assimilate the family's history into their own lives, and it becomes part of their identity, and it happens, more or less like osmosis. You just take it in because it's around you. It's from the attitudes of your parents or your siblings. You take it on board uncritically, and you cannot distinguish between you and this issue and other people who have come before you. I think it's important to look at it. Okay, so I'm going to talk for a few minutes about my own journey, I guess, because I do see myself as a replacement child. Now, I want to say very definitely that I was a child that was loved by both my parents and by my sibling, the one who is now my older sibling, my sister. I love her dearly. She loves me. We have a good relationship, and it's always been a positive thing in our lives. But there was something that happened a few years ago that I have mentioned before, but I would like to unpack it in a little bit more detail now. And that is that I had always been aware of the fact that I had had a brother who had died in infancy. These two pictures are me, by the way, not my deceased sibling. And that's the point I want to make. There is nothing, there is no memorabilia about this little boy who died. So there's not, a booty in a box. There's no clothing that survived. And yes, I mean, he only survived a few days into life. But from what I can tell from our family dynamics, this child had a very distinct impact on our lives. Fiona, you're very welcome. Thank you for coming. We really do appreciate that. I'm going to explain that a little bit more. So these are pictures of me. The fact that there are pictures of me, I think, says that my parents valued me well enough to take pictures, and, I have them. But there are no pictures of that little one. And it may be that, we didn't have the same resources as we have today. You couldn't pull out your camera from your pocket and take a picture. I understand all of that. But you'd think there would be some memorabilia of this little boy who died only a few days after he was born. Some card that somebody wrote, or some poem that somebody sent to my parents to comfort them, some Bible verse, maybe, I don't know, something, but there's absolutely nothing about this child. Now, in other words, if nobody had told me as a child and as a young man that I had an older sibling who had passed on, I would not have known it, because there's nothing in the family albums. I think that says something. Yet all my life, I was told by my mother about this little boy, and she said his name was John. And this was consistent through, 3/4 of her life. I see Kylie's commenting on my photographs. Thank you, Kylie. Little me. Yes, that's me. You can't see the fact that I'm holding a bunch of flowers. I don't know what that says, but there you go. That was me as a child in my waistcoat. So throughout my life, my mother would say that this little boy's name was John. But as happens to us all, she got old. She suffered, I think, some dementia began to set in, and stories began to come out very lucidly, very clearly. And one day I said to her, and I don't know why I said it, but I think this also indicates something else. I said to her, Mum, what was his name? Why did I ask that question? Because she told us all our lives that his name was John. And then she told me something that really made a huge amount of sense to me. And that is that his name was Michael. And on one level, I was surprised, but on another level, I wasn't surprised. And it's as though in that moment, something clicked in my life in terms of my understanding in my relationship to my parents in particular, and especially in relation to my father. Because as the stories came out, I have this impression of my father carrying this little tiny coffin in a taxi and making his way to the cemetery where this little baby was buried. I have that impression from what my mother was telling me about this period in their lives. And the impression I got, and this came out very much later on in a psychodrama session where I was the protagonist. I was doing my work with a very skilled psychodrama psychotherapist, and we were focusing on this idea of a replacement child, and it came out very much more deeply in that context, which is really what happens in such a therapy session. The impression I had was a very, very painful, grieving heart that my father had lost his firstborn, and his firstborn was a son. Now, later on, my sister was born a couple of years later, and then I was born 6 years after her. So I was the son who was then called Michael, just as my older brother, the firstborn in the family, was called Michael. Now, of course, this information I'm sharing doesn't necessarily mean that I am a replacement child, because parents and families naturally are going to want to have other children, especially after the death of a child. But you see, there is something operating with the replacement child syndrome if the child somehow feels as though they are carrying something on behalf of that child or on behalf of the parents. And that's what I want to focus on for a few minutes now, because in my experience, and I'm hoping there will be, there will be other stories that will come forward that we can compare notes. I would love to do that. If you hear of anyone who talks about the replacement child syndrome in their lives, I would love to hear their story. I know there have been several books now. If you, again, look at Amazon and put in replacement child, you'll find several stories come up. So this is not just, something of particular or limited interest. There are lots of other people in the world, but this is what I want to focus on. Later on in life, or as a young man, and even, in my late teens, I began to struggle with same-sex attraction. And if I characterize my struggle, it was very much about the fact that men were mysterious to me, and the feminine, the women around me, were much more knowable. They were not. There was no mystery about them. I feel as though somehow I was feminized to the point where masculine felt different and feminine felt the same as. Now, that played out in many ways, and there's no point to going into that particular detail right now. But what I am interested in is the connection between this and the replacement child. And this is what my own processing has brought to light. And I think God in his mercy gives us these insights, because for me, discovering that I actually was a replacement child was extremely liberating. It gave me a sense of the difference between myself and the rest of my family. I could then discern what was in the past and put it in the past and leave it in the past, and I could go forward with the things that were important to me. Now, this is the dynamic. It's coming that I want to share with you. When I had this perspective of my father carrying this child close to himself, I also, through my work, had an understanding that my father grieved so profoundly about this little boy that it is as though he put half of his own heart into that coffin and buried that child. Now, my father died before I had any opportunity to communicate with this, or to interrogate this situation, or to try and listen to his own, expression of how he felt. So it is speculation, but it is made a huge amount of, it's been very clear to me that this is what happened because of a whole lot of corroborating evidence that I experienced as a child in our family. I'll try and explain that a little bit later. You see, the impact of my father's grief was that I think by the time I came, 6 or 7 years later, it feels as though my father gave me to my mother. My father was there. He didn't go off into the sunset. He didn't leave the family. He didn't. My parents were balanced people. They would have their arguments, but nothing spectacular. They had their tiffs. And my sister and I would know, but there was nothing too traumatic about it. My mother was a nurse. My father worked in magistrates' courts. he was very much into law and, the legal things, and very keenly aware politically and in terms of how the law operated. He was a war veteran. He'd been at Alamein. He'd won the military medal. He was an excellent rugby player and a cricket player and a soccer player and a pool player. He would take me sometimes, but there was always a sense of the awkward. He loved to watch motor racing. We would go to the motor races, and I would try to engage, but I didn't quite get the cars going around. And on the football pitch, well, I was a complete hopeless player, to the embarrassment of everybody around me. I just didn't get it. And I'm sure, my father would notice that. Now, he never openly criticized that, but I did always have a sense of having disappointed him. But now here's the crux of the matter. My sense is that my father just could not emotionally connect with me. He did to a point. And if I honestly go back and think of all the things that happened in our lives, he had a level of sensitivity that I think it would be easy to fail to acknowledge. But the impact of his slight distance from me and his slight embarrassment with me and his not knowing the best way to work with me had I guess the upshot of that was that I went increasingly towards my mother and to the feminine, to my sister. That's where I gravitated. My friends were often, it wasn't that I didn't have male friends. I did, and they were good friends. But the basic direction, the comfort level was always with the feminine and not with the masculine. I wonder if anybody is relating to this. So how does this relate to the whole concept of the replacement child? Well, my experience was that I fulfilled the emotional gap that was caused by my brother's death when I was born, for my mother particularly. But for my father, it was as though this was too much of a threat. He could not invest in me closely because, of course, I too could die. And that's the impression that I always got, that I was always distant from my father. And that had a profound impact on my sense of self-esteem and my sense of worth. Okay, folks, enough of me. I'm going to move this on a bit and suggest to you that, again, you have a look at some of the questions that Dr. Abigail Brenner raises. So if you want to check it out, let's just go through some of these questions and see where they take us. So somebody who's struggling with the replacement child syndrome. Here's the first question. Were you aware from an early age of feelings as if you were living in the shadow of someone else? This can be a parent saying things, mentioning the deceased child and saying, well, he would never have behaved like that, or you really aren't very, you're not like your brother, or you're not like your sister. some of you are relating to this in a kind of secondary way, perhaps. So Ali is talking about this sense of mysteriousness he experienced with other men. He felt distant from them when he was growing up, and women felt a lot more familiar. And that's definitely one of the processes that one goes through. Once you have that realization that that's happened in your life, you can begin to re-socialize yourself and discover what you need to do to catch up to the masculine. I think that's important. So, second question, were you aware while growing up that there had been a deceased child born before you were? Was this child openly spoken about? And that's quite an important question, because in this scenario, the child doesn't have to be referred to often. Sometimes the silence is what is speaking in a family. A child dies, perhaps in tragic circumstances, maybe through illness, but maybe also through a road accident, some huge traumatic event, or even it can be a person taking their own life. And then the rest of the family from that point on says nothing about that person. So it's not only parents overcompensating by continually bringing that person into the present, which is a perfectly normal and reasonable thing to do. We don't want to forget about the deceased, but it's how we do it. But equally, it can be that there is such a silence around these events that it speaks continuously and loudly into a family context. Or question number 3, did you later in life or did you learn later in life about this deceased sibling? Had it been kept a secret? Did you sense, without knowing about this other child, that something felt wrong or was missing in a way that people in the family related to you? I don't know if you follow what this author is saying here, but I certainly can relate to it, because it always felt as though there was a gap that needed to be filled. And I couldn't understand the role of all of this in my family until much later on in life, and until I'd had this conversation with my mother just before she died. Number 4, did this recognition about yourself as a replacement child slowly unfold as you became an adult? It certainly was my case, but I'd love to hear from other people if they feel that. It's good to see you here, Karis. Thank you for coming. You're talking about the fact that you've come across a written case study of a boy whose mother had an abortion, and then who then wanted to be a girl. That's a very interesting trauma, isn't it? There must be so many stories here that it would be very useful, I think, to unpack and to listen to. Number 5, were you often compared to a child who had died? Was this child idealized? I mean, I think that is a really important question. If you are compared to somebody who is deceased, well, what can you possibly do? How can you respond to that? You can't check the facts, so to speak. Were they really so perfect as is being made out? Are you, or were you in that comparison genuinely less than the one who had passed away? What can you do with that? What can any child or young person do with such a comparison? This is the problem. A child in a family where these dynamics are working will simply take it on board through osmosis. They will just imbibe it. It will become part of their identity. And then lo and behold, 10 years later, they begin to unpack it and realize that they swallowed something that really just wasn't the truth and wasn't helpful at all in their lives. That typically is what happens. Let's just work with the remaining questions that Abigail Brenner brings up. I find them very helpful. I hope you do too. Number six, did you feel as if you could never measure up to this deceased sibling? You know, if this doesn't relate to you specifically, I think it's part of the ancestor syndrome that we were talking last week. Are you aware of, striving to achieve something that somebody has required of you? Are you, in other words, living a life that is not very authentic because, somebody in your family has put something on you, and you've believed something that brings, a kind of unidentified depression, or anxiety, or desire to perform that is not based on something that is really very healthy. Number 7, were you recognized in your family for the unique person that you are? Or did you feel that you were not seen or heard as yourself? If you were a sensitive child and you were in a household, as I was, with a father who I am sure was sensitive in very many ways, but not sensitive in the way I was. And therefore, we missed one another. And, when I saw him as such a huge achiever, sports-wise, and I don't think there was a bone in my body that could relate to that. Well, it's obvious there's going to be a struggle in a child in that position, finding their own role and discovering their own identity. Question number 8, do you suffer from the need to please? Are you a perfectionist? Do you suffer from identity confusion and or survivor guilt? Survivor guilt, you feel bad that you survived and your sibling died. Why is it that, you had this dreadful accident in your family and one of your family members died and you didn't? Is your perfectionism the kind of perfectionism that is beyond just trying to do things well? You actually can't survive unless it's done perfectly, because it has become, a part of an obsessive regime. It's a part of a security thing. I know lots of people who are high achievers, high performers, and they want things to be absolutely right. And I don't think there's any problem with that. What I notice about those people is when it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. And they will shift gears and they will go with what they've got, and they are satisfied with it. They got it to the level that they wanted to. But the obsessive person, they can't sleep or think or eat or do anything because something went wrong. And it seems to be coming from, in many cases, a desire to please. And the frustrating thing for them is they can't please themselves. And because they can't please anybody else, life can become very difficult and discouraging. So I'm not against doing things well and trying to be perfect and complete in the way we do things, but it's how we deal with that. and whether or not it becomes something positive. So hopefully you hear what I'm saying about perfectionism here. Number 9, if the death or incapacitation of a sibling occurred when you were an older child, what were the consequences for your life? Did you feel the need to take over for the deceased or incapacitated child? Did parents and other adults pressure you into assuming a role in the family in order to make up for the death or incapacitation or loss of a sibling? Well, friends, these are questions you have to kind of pick the meat and leave the bones once again, but hopefully some of them can be useful in discerning your position and role in the family. Well, goodness, that's a mouthful, isn't it? I hope it's been of interest to you today. I must just turn our attention now for a few minutes to what is coming up in the future. We're at episode number 8 today. Thank you for those who've stuck with us from the beginning, or with me from the beginning. Next week, we're going to be talking about trauma. And I have a guest with us, Dr. Anne Gillies, who is a trauma specialist, a counselor from Canada. And she's going to be talking about different types of trauma. We're going to see the role of trauma, how we can deal with it, and how we are best placed to work with that. So that's next week, same time, same channel, the role of trauma, big T trauma and little t trauma. Because, you know, it doesn't have to be a big T trauma that we're dealing with. It can be the little traumas of everyday life that really do impact on the quality of our lives in a very profound way. And we need to know how to deal with that and what support we can get to be able to deal with it. The last program, number 10, we'll look back over all that we've been talking about in these 10 weeks and try to come up with some of the major strategies that we have been dealing with. So in summary, today we've spoken about the replacement child, and I've offered this really as a way of drilling down in a bit more specific detail in the context of ancestor syndrome. The ancestor syndrome is very much about, you know, taking on a trauma or an issue that belongs to somebody else. And here I've tried to focus on one particular example, the replacement child syndrome, that I think is a good example of that happening. I've referred to my own life. I'd be so interested to hear from other people who may have a similar experience of being a replacement child in their family. I'd love to hear how that impacted on you. And, you know, if you can share how you put that into perspective, how you processed that, how you turned it into something that, you know, made you more aware positively, and help to shape your life so that you could be free to be who you were created to be and to achieve the things that you need to achieve, because you're a unique individual who's been created and loved into the world, and I would say is here for a specific purpose. So thank you very much, folks, for participating and being with us today. Please do write to me, mike.davidson@core-issues.org is probably the best address. Check out the stories of Ashley Whitehouse on X Out Loud, a great series of testimonies that are coming out every week. Just check out the Facebook X Out Loud page and you'll get information about the next event that's taking place and where you can access it and listen to it. Also, check out Denis Schick on help for the families. You can access a very good testimony and detailed account that she gave on the IFTCC site. That's iftcc.org. Just look for events and go to the 2019 IFTCC annual conference, and you'll get the information there. So, folks, thank you very much for your participation today. God bless you. I'm going to pray and ask God's blessing upon your life and upon my life and upon all the work that we do in different ways and as different individuals. Father, we give you thanks today for your presence and your graciousness as you reveal yourself to us and help us to free ourselves. You do the work, Lord. You are the one who sets us free. But you often give us insight and direction by which we can help ourselves and we can do things that will improve the quality of our lives. And that's what we ask for today, Lord, that we would be able to do the very best that we can do to achieve your purposes and to live life in an authentic way. So I pray for all those who have come today, for Vanya, for Ferguson and Kylie and Matthew and Fiona, Min, Ali, all of these folk, Lord, bless their hearts today. Encourage them, I ask. Keep them safe. And for those who observe this and who we don't know are watching, we ask your blessing upon them. Please put your finger upon their lives and help them to understand exactly what you are saying to them today. Help them to sense your presence and the fact that you are willing to set us free as we come to you. And that's what we do right now. We ask it all in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen. Thank you for coming, folks. God bless you. May you have a good week, and I hope to see you next week. Thanks again for being here today.